In this video, we'll talk about a couple concepts that can be useful to you when you're building the background elements of a campaign world that you've designed. What you'll find is I'll introduce you to a new web reference that might prove useful to you, and I'm also going to give you a downloadable PDF that includes a lot of detailed information about the Autropa campaign setting that I'm going to be using for the series of modules that we did back in the QuickPACE campaign planning worksheet. We're actually going to develop that campaign, all 10 series in that arc, as independent modular adventures suitable for first edition Dungeons and Dragons, or OSRIC compatible as it'll be called on the cover page. And I've released some of that information as community posts, but I just wanted to let you know there are some downloadables in the description section before we get started. And so now into the intro. Welcome back to the old dogwood tree here at Dogwood Hall. It's been a sunny, hot day. We're in the early evening is starting to cool off a little bit, so I thought I'd come out here and shoot the intro to this video. I want to talk a little bit about two words that we hear an awful lot on the internet, and as a social scientist, that they usually register for me anywhere from painfully erroneous to head-shakingly comedic, and those two words are culture and community. And you hear them in many other areas, not just within tabletop role-playing or old-school tabletop role-playing, but it's certainly two concepts that come up quite frequently. And so we want to begin by talking about culture first. And so we'll define that in a way, several ways as we go along. But let's start off by understanding it as an anthropological concept. In fact, it is the basic unit of analysis for anthropologists. And hence the culture concept has been important within the discipline of anthropology for a number of years. And so we'll go back to 1870 when E.B. Tyler first wrote Primitive Culture and included his definition at the very beginning of the book. And it was that complex whole which consists of knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities that humans acquire as members of a society. And I kind of put humans in brackets for the purposes of our definition here, for a couple reasons. Firstly, because one of the things that's changed since 1870 is we now understand humans aren't the only bearers of culture. And then two, I think the reason we want to put brackets on it, of course, is because when we're talking about fantasy world building, we're often going to be talking about species other than humans. If it's just the basics like elves and dwarves and orcs and halflings, or if you get into the more esoteric or even bizarre, they're all going to have distinct socio-historical trajectories that have resulted in unique independent cultures for that species. And even different species, if they were born and raised and separated by many generations, living on different planets, they're going to develop perhaps radically different elements of culture as part of their culture overall. And by the time we get to the end, we'll talk about the two concepts that are subsumed within the word culture. One is often called culture with a capital C, and that's culture in its human sense. It's all these traits that we're applying: knowledge, belief, art, law, moral, custom, and applied to that whole. And then there's also cultures, which we mean lowercase c is sometimes called, where we're talking about culture in its partitive sense. So it makes one group distinctly different from another group. So, here in the Earth, we're, of course, only talking about humans, but there are still many different cultures. And when we get to the end, I'm going to introduce you to a website that's very similar to an old tool that anthropologists have consulted that lists not only as many cultures as possible from around the world, but also many of the traits and attributes found within those cultures. So when you're looking for analog, you can go to this site. It's called dplace.org, and I'll put the reference up at the end, put it down below in the description. And you're also going to find that there's a downloadable design document. As a contemporary practitioner, then, I want to offer my anthropological definition of culture. Culture is a complex adaptive system consisting of learned behaviors and thought patterns that is always made manifest by a group, making that group distinctive from other groups. It is not instinctive, but rests on a biological base of A. Binocular stereoscopic Keller vision, B. Habitual upright bipedal locomotion, C. Generalized forelimbs with opposable thumb, and D. Possession of symbolic capacity, usually defined as having around 750 to 900 cubic centimeter brain volume. Culture is transmitted through linguistic means, extra-linguistic means, and through temporally durable material behavior. Is cumulative, encompasses actions, beliefs, and cultural materials, and functions as humankind's total communication system. All right, so from here, I think what we need to do is start moving into a direction that will make these concepts useful for developing tabletop role-playing games, your campaign settings for tabletop role-playing games. But we want to start by sticking then with Tyler's definition that culture consists of everything that humans make, do, or think about. The consequences of making, doing, and thinking then are the actions, beliefs, and traditions and cultural materials, which can all be taken as forms of information. And when I say information, what I'm actually talking about is knowledge that is trapped inside your head, in your brain, and you need to relate it, to impart that information to another human being. You need to transmit it to the receiver in some way that they will comprehend. Part of that is language use, whether that's spoken word or written word, but that's always going to be an imperfect transmission. In other words, you're not going to send all the data that's inside your brain directly over to the brain of another person. So they have to receive your transmission and then interpret the signal that they receive. And a lot of that is going to be from their own cultural background. So cultural materials then record actions in each and every attribute, and patterns of systematized actions reflect overall beliefs and traditions, which in turn influence material behaviors that result in these cultural materials, the artifacts, the objects that we deal with, that we handle, that we interact with, that interpose between us and our goals, the physical things that we have with us in the world. We can then draw two conclusions to inform our world building. The first, culture is an information system wherein the messages are accumulated survival information, plus miscellaneous random noise peculiar to each system and its past trajectory. 2. A culture system's capacity as a regulator or insulator cannot exceed its capacity as a communication system, since only variety in culture can force down variety in outcomes. Information cannot be transmitted in larger quantity than the system's variety allows, and the greater the number of connecting channels or networks, the greater the number of coded means of intercommunication, that is, artifacts, activities, speech, writing, etc. The greater the regulatory potential of the system as a whole. And so now we come to one of the stranger quirks of what we think of as progress in civilization, and that's namely these materials that we produce have actually made our lives easier in the sense of we no longer have to reduce everything to having the locus of interaction be a face-to-face interaction with another person. We can interpose materials between ourselves and communicate things about our daily lives. And just gonna give a quick example of this. The idea might be, look at the doorway and the door. So primitive culture may have been living in rock shelters and caves and that sort of thing, although some probably did live in huts. And of course there's nothing there. You don't have a beaded curtain to pull across the front of your cave, and the neighbor from the cave next door can just walk on by and see what you're up to. They hear what you're up to all the time, so there are no mysteries. If you burn your bacon, the neighbor knows it because that smell just wafts right on over. So we kind of move from there, where maybe we go into the hut and we maybe develop curtains or some sort of baffle or other barrier that provides means to screen seeing what's on the inside of your home from what's people just happen to be passing by outside your house. And then we can move from there to where we have a door, and then we can add appurtenances to those doors. So now we're not only blocking vision and more sound with a heavy wooden door, we can also add a lock to it, and therefore prevent. We don't have to be home to tell people don't come into our house. We can leave and lock the door, and maybe they have to test it to find out that the door is locked. But the understanding is that you don't have to write a sign on the door that says the door is locked, you won't be able to open it, although that might stop them from testing it out. But no, what we want to do here is move into a discussion then of socio-natural systems and subsystems. And so we're going to look at the thing on the left here, and we'll note that what's going on the outside, and all these things are interconnected with one another. So it's what makes it a complex system, is that you cannot necessarily deduce just from simple inputs and outputs how one subsystem will affect parts of another. It's not always predictive, and some of it remains black box. You can only ever see inputs and then the associated outputs, and you just kind of have to deduce what's going on within the black box. So our external environmental features then, which are themselves all interconnected and interrelated, fauna, animals, flora, plants. Geology would probably be more appropriately called physical geography or geomorphology for most people. I mean, you're aware of the landscape features around you, but not necessarily the surface geology, let alone structural geology or that sort of kind of deep earth influences. But then we also have the other physical science influences like climate, so meteorologically what's going on in your little neighborhood or in your region, in your country. Is it monsoon season? Are you having a hurricane? Are you expecting one next week? Is this the rainy season, the dry season? And then in the middle of all that, what we have is the S with subscript N, and S standing for societies, and then the total number of societies. So each of them we'll treat individually, or would be treated individually, but we're also having to look at the sum total of all societies that are within those interconnected physical environmental systems. And so between society and the physical environment around us, those interactions then are mediated by technology, the tools that we develop, the cultural materials that we use to insulate ourselves then from that outside world and from each other. Now we look at the social subsystems that are being mediated by the technology in conjunction with the environment, and we have 4 here. So we have economy, we have social pattern, we have material culture, and we have religious pattern. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between cultural material and material culture when we get to the end of this slide. And that's sort of we're an exploded view. So each of those is going on within the particular S script N that we're talking about at any given time. And those are themselves interrelated, interconnected, completely integrated with one another, so that they are themselves a complex system. You cannot necessarily predict, how a change in one of those subsystems is going to impact any or all of the other subsystems. And then, so we'll put this then into one big diagram, and again show that everything is interconnected, interrelated, integrated, complex adaptive systems, and they do adapt to changes, perturbations within the system, but again, not necessarily always predictively in terms of understanding how a change in one little subsystem, say the religious subsystem there, you add a new rite to the old religion, and you don't think about, maybe we decide we're going to sacrifice cult idols at the service, kind of thing. Oh, that goes into the economic subsystem, because now you got to make more cult idols because you're going to be breaking them during some particular rite or another, or maybe all of them. And Clark put in the middle of all this the psychological subsystem, and so here's where we're going to start to deviate from exactly Clark's terminology. His verbiage is a little different from what I would use. We tend to, there's a branch of anthropology called psychological anthropology, so obviously we do psychologize humans, but one of the things that we're taught is not to overly psychologize our subject. We're looking at groupings of humans and how they go about practicing groupings amongst themselves, that sort of thing. And it's not that we don't want to understand also how the individual relates to the group. It's just that you sort of have to start from a point where I'm not a mind reader. I cannot, reach into your thoughts and know exactly what you're thinking. I can only know what you're telling me and what I observe from your behaviors and that sort of thing. And so here's a case where I actually prefer the German term Weltanschauung, or the kind of what the French have in mind when they say mentalité, and then we're talking about your mindset, or your, it's worldview, but it's your personal mindset about what you're seeing, kind of, where worldview, I think, is more general and structural. That mindset can be that too, but it's also very specific and applies to what's going on at every instant that you're perceiving. And then the other thing is that we'll keep talking about this, is I just don't like the term material culture. Material is what culture is, first of all, is ideation. It's the material then becomes the objectifications, the physicalizations of our cultural knowledge. And so that's why I don't like material culture. But I also use a perspective from Roland Fletcher that he calls material behavior. And so that's another kind of an acceptable term for me. And here we're almost drawing on Richard Dawkins' idea of the extended phenotype, where he talks about a kind of wasp where the built into their makeup to produce these kinds of nests. And I think that's probably partially true with us too, is that the culture has sort of supplied us with a level of programming that we're tool makers by nature now, I guess. Sort of, it's a culturally influenced nature, but that's really what I'm getting at. Now we want to turn to making some more definite statements about the culture concept, beginning with the idea that culture is an idea. Culture is ideation made visible through objectifications. And this is taken from Walter Taylor's 1948 A Study of Archaeology. Culture is a mental construct consisting of ideas. Under the term idea, for present purposes, are subsumed such categories as attitudes, meanings, sentiments, feelings, values, goals, purposes, interests, knowledge, beliefs, relationships, associations. These ideas are not themselves observable. They are objectified and made observable through the action systems of the body, being activated in the form of behavior that is observable, both visually and audibly. In turn, this behavior results in material objects, such as axes and automobiles. and non-material manifestations such as dance patterns, musical tones and rhythms, styles of graphic and fictile representation, etc. Next, we want to get back to something that was mentioned at the beginning of the video, namely that the culture concept has two aspects. The first, often referred to as culture with a capital C, involves its nature as a holistic explanatory concept. By culture as an explanatory concept, I mean all those mental constructs which are used to understand and react to the experiential world of internal and external stimuli. However, we also have culture as a partitive concept, or culture with a lowercase c. And this is what we refer to when we're talking about a group's culture and how it is distinctly different from other cultures. And by culture as a partitive concept, I mean a historically derived system of culture traits, which is a more or less separable and cohesive segment of the whole that is culture, and whose separate traits tend to be shared by all or by specially designated individuals of a group or society. Another important part of the partitive concept of culture, culture with a lowercase c, is that if an individual is the only person within that group to carry a particular cultural trait, let's say it's a certain way of decorating pottery, then it is still cultural in the capital C sense, is that it is a non-natural behavior, but a cultural one. However, it is not cultural in the partitive sense, in that it is still an idiosyncrasy. Only one person holds that trait. When it becomes shared with other people within the group, then it would become part of culture with a lowercase c, or culture as a partitive concept. Now we have an idea of culture as ideation with material results. Let's talk a little bit about culture traits and culture processes. Culture traits are manifested by cultural agents through the medium of vehicles. In the case of human culture, these agents are human beings. The cultural vehicles are the objectifications of culture, that is, the observable behavior and results of behavior. Cultural processes are the dynamic factors involving cultural traits. They do not constitute culture, but comprise the relationships between cultural traits. As we move ahead and we start looking at static diagrams of cultural subsystems, it's important to remember that those are static representations, that in reality, all of those subsystems are in motion and interconnected and fully integrated and interrelated with each other as they move along in complete dynamism. And kind of our next breakdown is we'll talk a little bit about cultural materials. You also see it written commonly as material culture. This is something that I like to move away from. I personally use Roland Fletcher's concept of material behavior rather than material culture, or cultural materials works for everyone. So the term material culture is a misnomer, and the dichotomy between material and non-material relates only to observable results of cultural behavior, not to culture itself. So to kick off our discussion then about the concept of community, I'll provide you with an anthropological definition of community that I use. By community, I mean small groups, such as households, bands, or tribal organizations, but also imagined groupings that may never meet yet hold some interest in common. Communities may be embedded one within another, overlap, and differ in importance, duration, interest, and internal structure. Their borders may be firm or porous. Communities are held together by shared interests that constitute their base, and networks of relationships connecting people through the base make up communities. These networks can be thick or thin sets of ties that vary in strength and importance. Some ties are perceived as eternal, others are shorter-term alliances formed to face a common problem, promote an issue, or confront a mutual enemy. And this definition is taken from Stephen Goodman's definition provided in his chapter of an economic anthropology handbook. And the chapter title is Community and Economy, Economy Space. If we want to talk about community in its simplest and most comprehensive terms, then we might look at Victor Turner's definition for his concept of communitas. Is a relationship between concrete historical idiosyncratic individuals. These individuals are not segmented into roles and statuses, but confront one another rather in the manner of Martin Buber's I and Thou, that is, as fellow free-willed autonomous beings, not as objects to be exploited for our own ends. Along with this direct, immediate, and total confrontation of human identities, there tends to go a model of society as a homogeneous, unstructured communitas, whose boundaries are ideally coterminous with those of the entire human species. Communitas itself soon develops a structure in which free relation slugs between individuals become converted into norm-governed relationships between social personae. Turner further subdivided his concept of communitas into a few aspects. The first of which is the existential or spontaneous, primarily event-driven, arising quickly and typically of short duration. For example, people working to help each other following an accident or disaster. Also, the normative aspect of communitas. Under the influence of time, the need to mobilize and organize resources, and the necessity for social control among the members of the group in pursuance of these goals, the existential communitas is organized into a perduring system. And finally, we have the ideological aspect, which presents a quote-unquote utopian model based on the systematized outcome of the existential communitas. So let's provide a brief example that kind of outlines what you might think of as the different parts of these aspects. So in the first case, the existential or spontaneous, let's think about a neighborhood house fire. Everyone comes out of their house and they all sort of take on these roles in responding to the fire. Some go to get buckets of water, some go to get ladders to help people escape from the burning building. Some people take on the people that are recovered from the building and move them out to safety. And it perhaps goes well, it perhaps doesn't go well, but they learn from that experience. And so we move in then to the normative aspect, where within the neighborhood they start to formalize the duties, we'll say. So now we have a neighborhood meeting and we say, well, in case of future house fires, you'll go get buckets of water, you'll go get the ladder, you'll be responsible for escorting the people that we recover from the building to a safe zone, and so on until all the duties that we can think of are assigned to people. And in the last aspect, what we might think of as the ideological, then it becomes a matter of, based on, our normative concept, the duties we assign the neighborhood because of this one event that we had that was, subject to the spontaneous aspects of communitas. Now we have an idea. We want to go to the city council and suggest that in the future there ought to be different policies involved with neighborhood fires. We might go to the federal level and insist that all buildings should meet a certain level of fire resistance going forward, and then any building that doesn't have that particular level of fire resistance ought to be condemned and torn down. And this again may or may not be advisable. That's not the point here. The point here is that we have in mind the quote unquote utopian model of how neighborhoods should deal with house fires, but that's carried through to the greater public by this community of people who are interested in primarily what's going on in their own neighborhood, but they want to see that expanded outwards to the entire society. All right, so what we want to do is kind of give you some concrete examples to think about with these ideas. And so we're looking at communitas, and we're saying that there's these three aspects of communitas, and they are the existential or spontaneous, they are the normative, and they are the ideological. But what does that look like in real world, relatable terms kind of thing? And so the example I want to give you is sort of let's talk about a house fire in a neighborhood. Could be my neighborhood, could be your neighborhood, could be any neighborhood. But the way that the individual residents respond to it. So Victor Turner even mentions that things like disasters are one of the things that we're talking about, where spontaneously erupting communities occur. And so the idea is that we go from a house fire that you weren't expecting it to happen. It happened, and everybody comes out of their house, and we all sort of decide for ourselves what we might be able to do best to help out, if indeed we want to help out. Presumably, most people would, and it becomes a matter of sort of announcing to the crowd what you're going to do. Oh, I'll go get my hose. Oh, we'll go get our buckets. Oh, we'll try to help people out of the house. Oh, well, I'll go get some blankets and stuff ready at my house so you can bring them over there, and we'll get everybody settled and get the fire put out, and then we'll figure out where we're going from there. That's a good example of sort of the spontaneous idea of community. But then let's move to the normative phase, and now what we have is we've been through this traumatic event in the neighborhood. We've had a house fire, property damage, maybe people's health and safety was at risk, of course. Hopefully nothing happened to anyone. It's examples, so we'll say it didn't. But then the idea is we start thinking about amongst ourselves as a neighborhood, as a community, the normative idea of community. How we're going to respond should such an event occur again. Now, instead of like randomly, I'll go get my hose. Well, maybe your hose wasn't the best. Maybe you only had a 50-foot hose where somebody else had a 20-foot hose, or a high pressure water hookup, or something. So we talk a little bit about our assets and resources, and we decide on a formalized plan of, if in the future there's a house fire, how are we going to respond to it? And we put that plan together to such detail that we can be reasonably assured it will be followed. Maybe we even run drills in between, potential other disasters that hopefully don't happen. Try not to jinx myself. I don't want any fires at my house or in my neighborhood. So then the last idea then would become the ideological. What would this look like in terms of our example? Well, we've had a fire. We reacted to it by putting together a neighborhood plan of action in case of future fires. Well, now we want to go downtown and talk to the city council and tell them about our experience with both the original fire and the putting together a neighborhood community action plan for dealing with future house fires. And we kind of have an eye towards getting them to maybe put some laws on the books, or set aside some funding that they can allocate for these kind of programs to happen in other neighborhoods. Maybe talk a little bit about rules and regulations we think ought to be, for everybody's community action plan versus ones that are specific to just our neighborhood or certain other kinds of neighborhoods. That maybe there's more wood buildings, or the warehouse district is cut off from the residential areas by wide gaps, and so a fire there might have a big commercial impact, but it wouldn't be up to the residents to come up with a fire response plan. Maybe we think that ought to be something that the city council would consider for application to the city. So now that's sort of our three phases. Then we had spontaneous. It was response to a specific disastrous event in this case. And then we have the next phase, which is the normative, where we've kind of come up with a formalized plan. We maybe talk about doing some drills and that sort of thing to make sure the plan that we put in place is effective. And then lastly, we start recommending this practice to others as a formalized sort of response to a sudden and unexpected disaster. Let's take a closer look at each of Tönnies' concepts, beginning with Gemeinschaft, which is often translated as community, although it might be even better translated as fellowship. Tönnies define this as founded upon mutual understanding or consensus, which rests upon intimate knowledge of one another, reflecting the direct interests of one being in the life of another, and willingness to share in his or her joys and sorrows, typified by social ties between kith and kin or practitioners of a shared religion, but also present in what Tönnies called commonwealths, which would include households, villages, and towns. The will of a commonwealth is usually represented in its assembly by one man, the prince, by a number of people, the nobles and elders, and by many, the masses, the people, acting in concord. But the full majesty of the Commonwealth proceeds above all from the cooperation of these three organs, even though to all appearances one of them may be in the ascendant and another may be withering away. In opposition, we have Tony's concept of Gesellschaft, which is often translated as society or civil society, but which might be better translated as association. So we have an association, on the other hand, is an arrangement consciously thought up or invented, which helps its creators to express their common rational will in any respect they may choose. In this latter case, our main task is to inquire about the end for which that rational will decides the motive and means. The term can then be applied to the concept of the state as the most general and universal embodiment of a Gesellschaft type association. Gesellschaft may therefore be imagined as consisting of separate individuals who en masse work on behalf of society in general, while appearing to work for themselves, and who are working for themselves while appearing to work for society. Yeah, so I'll try not to go on as long with this particular example. The definitions for both these terms, despite them being German words, makes it pretty clear and obvious, what the distinctions are. But I still wanted to give a concrete example because I think it's good practice, and I've already done it for some of the other concepts. So bear with me while we talk about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And for the Gemeinschaft, it's always going to be based on personal relationships, direct kind of established personal relationships between people that you know, uh, for the most part. So, and then Gesellschaft, the association, the society, becomes a at a time, or becomes something that you deal with when you can't know everybody individually by name. And what you're really doing is we've made these agreements, formal agreements with each other, but through the agency of government or a planning council or whatever the case may be. And then our attitude becomes one of, we're obligated to the other people. And if we thought about them as individuals, we'd certainly understand that part of it. But we really feel the obligation to the system that we've set up, to society, to the rules and regulations to which we've agreed ourselves. And so, the concrete example then, just make it very simple. Let's say I'm walking through my neighborhood and I've decided to unwrap a piece of chewing gum, put the gum in my mouth, and then what do I do with the wrapper? Well, I might just throw it away. And in it, first, I guess first thing is to understand that you don't necessarily have to be, it's not mutually exclusive terms. It's not that it has to be either just, everybody is organized, communities are organized through Gemeinschaft, or communities are organized through Gesellschaft, and it has to be one or the other. There's always going to be sort of a polar opposition between those two, or a contrastive binary opposition between those two, where it's on a continuum and it's perhaps more one or more the other, but both are involved, except in maybe extreme cases at one end or the other. All those might be different points in history other than contemporary. So, when I talk about, our example, I'm walking through I chew my gum, I throw it off to the side. Now, in Gemeinschaft, where I'm thinking about personal relationships, I might stop myself from throwing that wrapper on the ground. But I think to myself, this is the house where John and Mary live. And, they're not going to appreciate having to come out and pick up this gum wrapper if I just throw it here. So I'll put it in my pocket, take it back home, and throw it away at my house. Versus where Gesellschaft, the obligation is now to the rules and regulations, to society itself. And that becomes a matter of, I don't want to throw away my wrapper here because littering is against the law and there's a $500 fine for it. So if I got caught at it, or somebody's taking a picture or a video of me unbeknownst to myself, I'm at unawares, then I might be on the hook for an expensive fine, or maybe I have to do community service, kind of going around cleaning up garbage in other people's neighborhoods. And so, sure, I want to keep everything beautiful, but I also don't want to deal with the $500 fine.
To bring all this back around to something that's useful when we're writing for our tabletop role-playing games, whether that's world building or character making, it all goes back to cultural context or just context, and the search for the pattern and the processes involved in the dynamic executions of those patterns. And so we look back again to our diagram of the environment and cultural and biological systems and their subsystems. And that is a pattern that we can freeze time for just a moment so that we can analyze it. But we must always remember that that's on our side for analytical purposes. In reality, the pattern is always dynamic. It's always in motion. And that motion, that pattern state from one to the next to the following, and so on, is then the process of culture change. And so when we talk about context, we'll look back again to kind of Walter Taylor's definition. In addition to the description of cultural behavior and its results, that is, the material consequences, a cultural context consists of the associations and relations of these elements, of the balance between them, of their relative quantitative and qualitative positions within the whole. So, most importantly, how and why does that pattern change over time? What are the processes that drive that change? Ultimately, things are always in the process of changing, becoming, as it were. The cultural configuration, that is what we're capturing in this diagrammatic representation, reduced to a pattern, is only a contrivance of the researcher for the purposes of analysis.
So I'm not going to try to go through this entire document. It's about 18,500 words or so spread across almost 40 pages, but that includes the full page graphics. So just wanted to kind of give you a brief overview of what the PDF looks like. You can download it. It's from Google Drive, so you can also just read it on Google if you don't feel like downloading it. But here's your cover. We started with a design document that we had done previously, which is this 7 hex across hex crawl map that we've done. That's that video is also available on my Adventure with Dragons free Hex Map downloads, so you can download multiple sizes, and in a little bit we'll go over the actual form that I've filled out as an example, and you'll see another version of the different scale of the hex maps that I'm using for this purpose. But this is a drawing that I've already done, put in a video, talked about, and it was the basis for the physical location, which is again based on alternate Europe, which is why the name is called Autropa. And you'll see we have an introduction here, some written general context, nature of the religion, some regional history, some notes about the people, language, the physical setting. And then we'll get to specific context, which is where we kind of break down at a couple different levels. So you'll see the second section here is brief polity description. That will go, country by country, essentially talking about what those people are doing specifically in that location. However, there's a kind of higher level abstraction here. So we have the Svaran tradition, Anglo-Tarian tradition, Terhaldian tradition, Burgundian, Aquilonian, Numidian. These are all potentially groups that span more than one country or state or polity, whichever you want to think about it here. We'll be calling it polity because that's sort of the most inclusive. They're not all going to be kingdoms. In fact, the main location for this first series of adventures is the Grand Duchy of Greenville, but it has some historical tie. So anyway, what we get is, this is our map. You'll notice it looks a lot like France, and that's because in the real world, in physical Earth, that's what we're talking about. Eventually we are going to expand more down into the Iberian Peninsula. Parts of it I already know what's going on there. For Spain, Iberian Peninsula. The part that I don't know about is central Spain and the southern half of Portugal, we'll say. So there's a swath in there from central Spain to the kind of southwest that is still undeclared as far as what I want to put in there. Although I know what's going on in all the other places and how they relate to the areas already described. So, we have the key with all these numbers relating to all these names. You can go through that, and these scale bars are accurate. So if you want to know distance between them, you can measure it out. And I've also included, since this is based on physical Earth, the longitude and latitude coordinates here on the border. And so you can kind of see, now this is a 19th century topographic map. This has already been used in another video, but just mention it here because where these cities are that we're converting for use for a fantasy campaign setting are all on the map that we're talking about tonight. So, or in this video. Maybe it's not night for you or me anymore. So then we just go through all these parts. I'm not going to go through them specifically, but they give you an historical context, a cosmological context, where we talk about the kind of gods that are going on there. There's one main god, Lawrence, also known as the cosmic architect. It's the god of law. There are 6 gods, sometimes known as the Hexatine gods or the 6 greater titans. Here they are, and here are their little domains. Secret out of the bag: before all 10 adventures in this arc are out, there will be a 7th god revealed, the god of well, I don't know if I should tell that part, but say some of it is cosmos and stars, and there's one more thing in there. It's chaos. Okay, I let it out of the bag, I guess. But anyway, that'll be the secret of the Septine gods or some sort of thing. But there's already the 6 on the board, and then Ilm or nature is the cosmic balance, and that's what the druids are worshiping here. And I won't spoil it all, but druidry is not necessarily practiced openly in some places. Especially like the main campaign setting is very much part of the Svaran tradition, and they are all very much worshippers of Lawrence, the god of law. They do tolerate druids because druids are also known for academic and scholarly learning, not just for magic and religion, and nature religion. But they don't tolerate a lot of them within the Svaran lands, the various states, polities, countries that are filled with Svaran people. And there's some variation, of course, around the different countries, and you can read through this document and find out what those are. So we get a brief outline of the history. It keeps going on. More about the groupings of the people. Fair folk, fell folk, and fae. And now, I would say one thing here is there is not exactly a common human language. You'll find that there's not a language spoken for every country. There's several languages, and they tend to cross borders and that sort of thing. Here's a few pages about the physical setting. Here is something I talked about at the very beginning, and I'll come back to this, and we'll take a look at that website real fast. But the rest of it is then we'll go to the different cultural traditions, and these are the sort of major shared beliefs, learned behaviors, and so forth that are all the countries that are part of that sovereign land. So the Grand Duchy of Greenville, where most of the adventures of the first series of the first campaign is going to take place, but also just south of there is the Kingdom of Sovaris, and that's of course named after the Sovaran people and that sort of thing. So, and then there's the Prelacy of Lawrence, which is formerly a part of the Kingdom of Sovaris, as are all these places, and then the Grand Duchy of Lawrenceburg, which is actually where Luxembourg is, and it's got a little extra territory in there and some connection with the elves. But then we'll do specific contexts, and that's where we talk about like traditions. Brief polity description. We'll do the brief polity descriptions, and that's where we describe, maybe sacred but mostly secular things that are going on with people, places, and things. What's going on as far as different types of institution, like churches and schools and that sort of thing. What's going on as far as how is the military structured, how are politics structured, who has what kind of power, what kind of rivalries are there for power, and that sort of thing. Then we can talk about how we deal with handling polity development on a form, and that's when we'll turn, at the end of the video, we'll just actually break out the form that I used and go over some of my notes. And then I made a few concluding remarks, and also tacked on a few maps at the end. And then, as you can see, here's a blank version of the form that's included with that PDF, so you can print that out as a two-sided form, so you can print it out on 2 pages or print it front and back. You'll see I've done mine front and back. So before we go and look at that, we'll just quickly bring up this link to dplace.org. This is very similar to an old tool that anthropologists have been using for many years to study different cultures, or to collate all the information that we have from different ethnographic researches and ethnological studies and archaeological work about different cultures, mostly extant cultures. What's going around now, you won't find much in the way of past societies in here, but you can see that the societies, data sets, variables are all part of that. The very old tool was first created by George Murdoch at Yale University, is the Human Relations Area Files. You often see abbreviated as HRAF. That's a paid service. I receive free access through my annual dues to the Register of Professional Archaeologists, but that's probably not worth it for somebody who's just going to be making fantasy campaign worlds. I mean, unless you're making an awful lot of them with a lot of cultural differentiations within the world, which is probably never going to pay off for you in game. But we'll just look at societies real fast. As you can see, there's some. Look pretty. There are some sets that are based on the literature, or specific literature, but you can also just kind of go down here and go through the peoples of the world. They're organized by this ID, which is not necessarily human readable, or at least doesn't convey any information, but then it provides names for those people. And you could go through it, and if you wanted to search it, you can look through the map too if you wanted to find people that you do. But you say, like the Zulu here, it would tell you something about what region, where's kind of a central point for where they're going to show up on the map. And then here's a piece of the literature. This is George Murdoch, it turns out, and others concerned that wrote the ethnographic manual and ethnographic atlas. And so now we have kind of a page about the Zulus. And these are all individual cultural traits that were tracked, discussed, analyzed. So, boat building, fishing, gathering, house construction, hunting, leatherworking, metalworking, pottery making, weaving, agriculture. You'll find that's not stuff that they make, stuff that they do, but also talking about kinship and hereditary succession, political succession. So there's all these details, and you open those up, you can connect to each one. You'll see points on the map show the distribution. We talk about other related cultures that also have those features that are on the map at a specific percentage, so you could use that comparatively. And then you can also use the more, and that will give you multiple sources, if depending on how many are available, where fishing amongst the Zulu is discussed in the scholarly literature. So very handy website if you want to gather cultural. All right, so this is going to be our last segment, and you'll probably recognize this map. And here's our Hex Planning Worksheet in high detail. That's the one that's 7 hexes across, and in this case we're doing 1 hex equals 6 miles, or 10 kilometers roughly, and we've given that all sorts of symbology in terms of what we drew on the page. And on the back side of the form, I actually do know what the random tables will be here now. I just come back and write them in. I will probably build a notebook with this in it, and so that will be useful for me to still go back and fill those things in. Once again, you can find those maps, and the one I'll show you in a minute, in the video called Adventuring with Dragons free Hex Map downloads. You might remember this, of course, from the video that we did on the QuickPACE campaign planning worksheet, where we then have our little summary of the premise. And oh, hello, Etienne. I'm so glad you could join us in this video. You're not really on camera yet, but come on in, my friend. So then this adventure track is actually the 10 adventure arc of the campaign. And bear in mind, when I say adventure and arc and campaign, and I'm not talking about things that I expect the players to do. These are all kind of things that are going to go on in the backgrounds of these stories. Now, some of that will be contingent on decisions that the players have made, but that's the way it is. And we still have the back that kind of, you can go watch that video, get to the form. But then what we have is what those numbers break down to for the different quests in that series, in the campaign. They all come to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. And in the first one, we'll see that the quest is going to be some sort of pickup, and the overall theme for the adventure is sacrifice. But then there's 3 different kind of themes, kind of a first act, second act, third act sort of affair, where we have necessary sacrifice at the beginning, vengeance, kin on kin in the middle, and a revolt at the end. So again, those aren't going to be decisions that the characters play out. We're going to have a fight in the middle of my video, folks. Don't do that. Thank you. All right. So now we need to know about our countries, and we saw there's, 19 on the physical map, and a 20th place that's actually where Corsica and Sardinia are. That's going to be a wizard island, although Sardinia is going to be an island of non-wizards or wizard-adjacent peoples, or basically various trades peoples and other um, mercantilists and producers of supplementary materials for the wizards, that kind of thing. Uh, goes to procure their magic items and ingredients and all that stuff. So now the campaign worksheet is the one that we're talking about now. It's a Polity Planning Worksheet. Begins very simply. You give it a name, give it some general location text, give it a population, get a total area. I'm using GIS, so I can easily calculate the total area. You might just give it an estimate if you're not really sure. And you can always go back to when we talked about like 6 mile hexes being 30 square miles versus 24 mile hexes being about 500 square miles each. So then that gives you a rough idea of if you wanted to just kind of guesstimate it. Yeah, and then we'll talk a little bit about the settlement and community patterns. Settlement being the physical distribution of places where people live, and the community pattern being how they go about living together at those places. Now, the document will explain how to use the power. The four different types of power being talked about here are political, economic. Uh, what are you doing, buddy? Sorry, some cat-related mischief going on here. uh, okay, so lost my train of thought there. Political, economic, military, and intellectual. And then we got heraldry, which I drew in this terrible drawing. It's supposed to be a rampant lion. As you can imagine, what I'll do is I'll get electronic. I'll get a scalable vector graphic of a red lion that's in the public domain and use that. Development index is going to be agriculture and industry, manufacturing, commercial, and scholarship, sages, universities, schools, that kind of thing. The alignment wheel, one, you could just, put an arrow if there's one major alignment, that sort of thing. Or you could do kind of like a little directional rose diagram with, kind of each longer for the ones that have more of those type of alignment for the dominant alignment, and maybe shorter bars for lesser alignments. Habitation index. Here's a case where that's not necessarily talking about arable lands. We're talking about the percentage of the country where the people actually live. You probably, and I'm guessing in here, not going to go lower than about 30 or 40. Even at that, we'd be talking about inhospitable places like a desert or barrens of some sort. And I'm not going to go higher than 95% because there's always things like surface water, lakes and streams and ponds and little places where there aren't actually people living. Plus, the other thing you have to think about in the fantasy campaign world is that there's probably places where monsters still hold fast to their own territories and will defend them. So there aren't, not necessarily just humans, but what we're going to be calling the fair folk in this campaign setting. So then when you got a percentage of the land that's actually inhabited and your population, you can kind of calculate that out to a density in terms of people per square mile or square kilometer. I might at a later date talk a little bit more about why that's useful to know, or what that actually can tell us, or where the different delimiters are for human populations in the physical world. But largest settlement, and also gave kind of a distribution of the population there. Talk about spies and saboteurs that you can. You're playing the part of a kingdom, or whatever it has, Grand Duchy in this case, and so whatever their budget is, but you would pay 500 gold pieces per month per level or rank of the spy or saboteur. And they only go up to rank 5. So you can only employ up to 5. So you could pay at most, if you had a bunch of them. You'd be paying 2,500 gold pieces for a month for each one. Potentially 12,500 for the whole month is probably the most you're going to spend on your spies and saboteurs. It's a fairly arbitrary limit, so I guess if you figure it out for yourself a way you want to expand that, you could. Um, Major eco-regions approach. We can find out more about that. I guess I'll put the link in for the Food and Agricultural Organization's eco-region breakdown for the entire world. That's actually what we're using here. Also, in the video of make worse maps and play in deeper worlds, you'll find I think a link to the document there, but also more about how to use that kind of real world mapping data for making fantasy worlds. We'll also have the major population centers and their population. Then we move over here. We have the major terrestrial landforms and a category called fame. We'll talk about that in a second. So then we have the major surface water bodies, also known by fame. Now, it's not really that they're famous. It's really just a short word that I could use to indicate how well known they would be to most people within the polity. So no matter where you are in this particular area, you know about the Waze River, so its fame is 5. One of the things you'll find is I use this rank 0 to 5 thing across a lot of categories and statistics. If I get around to the finishing up my own game, you'll find that it actually has a lot of connections to that. All right, so backside of the form then, these are the major categories. Kind of, if you go back to the Clark diagram that we showed all the socio-natural systems and subsystems, well, we're reducing it to 8 categories. It's going to be language and communication, it's going to be government and society, commerce and industry, and military and warfare. This is our 4 primary or foreground processes. And then over here we're going to have custom and law, kinship and ritual, settlement and housing, and then finally environment. And it says mineral resources on this. I've already changed that back to natural resources, though. That might be a little less clear, but all the resources aren't necessarily going to be mineral. So I say more about it in the document, but it's just the idea. Things like attacking, using your powers, be they political, economic, military, or intellectual, and then potentially your spies and saboteurs. You can actually, the way that will work is those are also ranked. So from 0 to 25 is the maximum number over here. And basically then from 1 to 5 will be rank 1, and 21 to 25 will be rank 5, and it's evenly spaced in between. And that's the number of dice that you could roll. So, if you have a lot of military power, maybe 5 dice, versus a country that doesn't have much, maybe they only have 2 dice. It's kind of like Risk, like one side would roll 5 die, the other side would roll 2 die, except that if you're defending a home territory, meaning that you possessed it in the previous round, then you would also get an additional 1 die as the defender. That's another little Risk nod, I guess. And anyways, what happens is the points are deducted from these categories, the foreground processes. Those are all ranked in terms of 0 to 50, but really 1 to 50, because if you get to 0, you've got serious issues in that area. You are probably no longer your own country, even if you get the 0 to in just one of them. The secondary processes or background processes here, then you'll see that kind of connect, like custom and law and how kinship and ritual all really go to government and society, but settlement, housing, commerce and industry, environmental resources, military warfare, these feed into these. So these 4 feed into these 4. So what you can do is you can, at a 2 to 1 cost, when you're running low on points over here, you can take points from over here and add them into this column. And I don't think I really clarified how to renew points in this for this form yet, but it's something that at this point you can just kind of play around with it. It's really kind of a tool to help you move things along in the background, just in case you get lost in what you were doing, or lose track of what the secret political intrigues at the castle Three Kingdoms over were going on. You can just kind of put it back on track quickly by with a few dice rolls and that sort of thing. Um, but you can also build it up into a full system where you're kind of playing out political intrigues and whatnot without having to focus a great deal of attention in places where the characters are not actually adventuring or don't have direct information about what's going on. Anyway, this cultural index number is really nothing more than a mean of all of those. And then the last section here, you can keep track of treaties and, again, a rank statistic to say how important those treaties are to the power you're talking about, in this case, the Grand Duchy of Greenvale. And then the last thing was just a typical diagram and map for all these forms. In this particular case, I did a little hierarchy of the different countries that are under the Kingdom of Suvara. So what I'll call the Suvaran lands, and kind of how they relate to each other in the world. Now, last little thing here. This goes back to the Hex Map routine. You kind of understand why I call this the low detail version now, even though it looks like you could fit in more high detail stuff. Is I've taken just this one hex from this map and blown it up to this map. And don't look too long, because this is actually the adventure location key for the Autropa 1 modular adventure lair, Ruins of the Kobold King's Lair. And so if you pay too much attention, you'll know where all the major locations of adventure are for the wilderness portion of it. And yes, you can look at this because the actual dungeon is laid out a little bit differently now, but this is the mock-up of the Ruins of the Kobold King's Lair. It's kind of the design document. I just drew this out by hand. I ultimately I used Inkscape and turned this into a vector graphic, but I changed some things around when I did that, kind of expanded it in some places and pulled back in some others. But that's the long short of what we've done with the design document so far. Very closely, we're very close to completion on the Ot1 or Autropa 1 Adventure Ruins of the Kobold King's Lair. I've got a couple of things that there was like project scope creep to this, where I kept adding on things that I wanted to do with it. And first it was just about the culture and community and how to you actually use those concepts within the development of making an adventure or making a campaign world, that sort of thing, rather than just the crazy, often erroneous buzzword versions that you just hear bandied about on the internet that are sometimes like nails screeching across a chalkboard to me. Now, the other thing is, then we added the design document, and the more that I put on the design document, I realized that what I need to do is have the adventure pretty much ready to go once this video comes out. So hopefully within the next couple of days, I've got all the maps and graphics. Well, not all the graphics. I've got a portion of the maps are all done and that sort of thing, but there's still some figures I need to work out. Otherwise, it'll just be a bunch of maps and long blocks of text if I don't break it up a little bit more with some imagery. So I'm still selecting some final images for that, but the adventure is fully designed, almost entirely written, and the last major bit I have to do is just the little odds and ends, bits and pieces, kind of graphics that you can put in a column between sections and that sort of thing. But if you're interested in what the interior or different maps will look like, I've made a series of community posts about that. So I think I will just bring this to an end here, and I thank everybody for watching, and I hope to see you again at the next one.